Hi there.
Hello. Welcome to Vodcast II of LIT115, Darwin, Marx and Freud. And here
We go.
So the task for this coming week's seminar is to think about whether there is any such thing as the human. And I suppose it's quite counterintuitive to ask this question because you might think you know what the human is. I mean, there's a general sense that we ought to know what the human is. But Darwin, of course, allows us to think differently about the human. And that is the centre of what we're going to be talking about today. A brief overview of the structure of the vodcast. First of all, some contextual theoretical background, human exceptionalism or anthropocentrism, one of the key historical ideas that helps us understand the role that humans are thought to play in the world. So this is going back to before Darwin, the kind of discourse that Darwin intervenes in. Because we talked about it very briefly in this week's workshop, I'm going to talk a little bit about worms. Then onto the descent of man and four key discourses through which the difference between the human and the animal is conceived in Darwinian thought. Moving on to a short passage from the expression of emotions that complements the work of the descent of man. Some observations about different polarities as well. So human and animal obviously is an oppositional structure which complements and reinforces and is reinforced by other polarities of race and gender. So we'll be talking a little bit about how these sets of oppositions work in relation to one another and might be destabilized in relation to one another. We'll have some more theoretically infused ponderings from Fabienne on the dynamics of dissolution, and we'll end, as we always shall, with the workshop task. So human exceptionalism, anthropocentrism. So I think a number of you were using these terms in the workshop earlier this week. So we're not going to go into massive detail about them, but two key textual artifacts that help us understand what these mean in the historical theological constitution of the human. So a very famous image on one side from the Sistine Chapel is Michelangelo's creation of Adam. So God with beard, surrounded by angels, pokes finger at Adam, reclining naked. And the point of this image is that man, and of course this is gendered, is in God's image. So this is why humans are exceptional, which is to say they're better than other creatures because they alone are in God's image. And this is why anthropos, man, is at the centre of the world because God has ordained us so to be. And Milton's Paradise Lost has got some of the best descriptions of how this works. So from Book 8 of Paradise Lost, this is when God gives his instructions to Adam about his role on the planet. This paradise I give thee, count it thine, to till and keep, and of the fruit to eat. Of every tree that in the garden grows, eat freely with glad heart. And he goes on to say, all the earth to thee and to thy race I give, as lords, possess it, and of all things that therein live, or live in sea or air, beast, fish, and fowl, in sign whereof each bird and beast behold, after their kinds. I bring them to receive from thee their names, and pay thee fealty with low subjection. So Adam is charged with the task of naming all the different animals, and it's in that moment that the preeminence of the humanity is kind of authorized or ratified. So the animals crawl towards Adam with low subjection to pay him fealty. So this is why we know humans are exceptional among creatures. But we can look at the world differently, and this is what Darwin encourages us to do. So rather than looking at the world from the perspective of man, again, the gendered term, we can look at the world from the perspective of worms. And Darwin's final book, The Formation of Vegetable Mould Through the Action of Worms, helps us to begin to think about history differently. It ends at the conclusion with this very famous passage, which I misquoted in class, that worms have played a more important part in the history of the world than most persons would at first suppose. So you think history is about the great figures, the great wars, the great schisms, the great intellectual movements, But it's also about worms. Without worms, there's no agriculture. Without agriculture, there's no civilization. Without civilization, there's no literature. There's no LIT115. So all of this is premised on the world of worms. And having said in class that it's rather dry, this book, I went back to it, and it's not. It's amazing. And one of the things that I love about it, just dipping into it, is some of the stuff about worm sensorium, worm bodies, how worms experience the world, and how we might take seriously the task of imagining what it's like to be a worm. And Darwin engaged, with the help of his many children, with many really bizarre experiments about worms. My favourite is the one about music here. So there may be things in this module we say don't try this at home, but I say do try this at home. Get a bassoon, play it to a worm. This is how it would turn out. According to Darwin, worms do not possess any sense of hearing. They took not the least notice of the shrill notes from a metal whistle, which was repeatedly sounded near them, nor did they of the deepest and loudest tones of a bassoon. They were indifferent to shouts, if care was taken that the breath did not strike them. When placed on a table close to the keys of a piano, which was played as loudly as possible, they remained perfectly quiet. I love the phrasing and the poise of Darwin's prose here. I think one of the things that's important to note in this first quotation about worms is that he's interested in worms as embodying a kind of lack in this first thing. So what worms do not have that we have. But he turns it around in the next passage here. What unique properties worms have that we have, that we lack. So rather than thinking about humanity as fullness and animality as lack, we can also think about humanity as characterized by a series of lacks that the animal world, the kind of multifarious animal world embodies. So worms feel the world much better than we do. The whole body of a worm is sensitive to contact. A slight puff of air from the mouth causes an instant retreat. The glass plates placed over the pots did not fit closely, and blowing through the very narrow chinks thus left often sufficed to cause a rapid retreat. They sometimes perceive the eddies in the air caused by quickly removing the glass plates. When a worm first comes out of its burrow, it generally moves the much extended anterior extremity of its body from side to side in all directions, apparently as an organ of touch. That's worms. So worm world, Darwin's work on worms encourages us to think differently about the creatures and their place in the world. And this, 10 years before that last work on worms, is what he does in The Descent of Man, where he redraws and reconceives how we think of humanity, the human. And so in stark contrast to the image of God disposing life into Adam, God reproducing his image in the figure of the first man, very famous images from The Descent of Man. And actually these are the top one's not for The Descent of Man. Obviously that's a more recent one. The bottom one is from T.H. Huxley, I think. So very, very famous set of images known as the March of Progress, where the humanity's movement historically in evolutionary time from gibbon to human is traced through the shifting posture of the body. So rather than a fixed, separate, unchangeable identity, the human is understood as continuous with animals over very large spaces of time. And this is how Darwin works back from the human to our most ancient ancestors at the end of The Descent of Man. We thus learn that man is descended from a hairy-tailed quadruped, probably arboreal in its habits, and an inhabitant of the old world. This creature, if its whole structure had been examined by a naturalist, would have been classed amongst the quadrumana, as surely as the still more ancient progenitor of the old and new world monkeys. The quadrumana and all the higher mammals are probably derived from an ancient marsupial animal, and this through a long line of diversified forms from some amphibian-like creature, and this again from some fish-like animal. In the dim obscurity of the past, we can see that the early progenitor of all the vertebrata must have been an aquatic animal, provided with branchiae, with the two sexes united in the same individual, and with the most important organs of the body, such as the brain and heart, imperfectly or not at all developed. So all of this is written or coded somehow into your body. These are your earliest ancestors, unsexed, with brain and heart imperfectly or not at all developed. Discourses of the body in Darwinian evolutionary theory obviously are related to discourses of the mind. And this is one of the anxious tightropes that Darwin is interested in walking in The Descent of Man. How does he insist upon the bodily continuity of Homo sapiens with earlier, less developed, in quotation marks, forms of life, with the demand of his readership that you've still got to cling on with humanity as being somehow exceptional. This, again, towards the end of The Descent of Man, actually, this is the last paragraph, a very famous passage in which he faintly echoes Shakespeare's Hamlet, and what we might think of as a kind of proto-Darwinian or proto-evolutionary sentiment in Hamlet. What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty. But behind this is the idea that in the fraught state of Hamlet in this moment, it's just the quintessence of dust. So a play on what is high and what is low. And this is what's going on at the end of The Descent of Man. Man may be excused for feeling some pride at having risen, though not through his own exertions, to the very summit of the organic scale. And the fact of his having thus risen, instead of having been aboriginally placed there, may give him hope for a still higher destiny in the distant future. But we are not here concerned with hopes or fears, only with the truth as far as our reason permits us to discover it. And I've given the evidence to the best of my ability. We must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man, with all those noble qualities, with sympathy which he feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect which is penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. So man is both going up and anchored to the earth at the same time, both looking towards the stars, but always trapped into the inevitable animality of the bodily, indelible stamp of his lowly origin. Some of the more intricate questions that Darwin is concerned with in The Descent of Man about the difference between humans and animals concern the very complex idea of instinct. We tend to think of instinct in quite simplistic terms as something that is just innate to us. So in the expression of emotions, chapter 14, Darwin writes, although most of our expressive actions are innate or instinctive, as is admitted by everyone. There's a kind of common knowledge and established truth that what we do, how we behave, is somehow hardwired into our system. But that does raise some complicated philosophical questions. If we think of ourselves as free, self-determining agents of our own destiny, how is that reconciled with the idea that our behaviour is structured by some kind of deeply ingrained evolutionary mechanism? There's a kind of inhumanity to the idea of instinct, which is brought out most gloriously and amusingly in one of Darwin's most quirky interpreters, the novelist and natural historian Samuel Butler, whose work I really love and would recommend to you. And this is one of my favourite passages of Samuel Butler. Samuel Butler hated Darwin and berated him continually, and Butler had a kind of slightly different, darker view of evolution than Darwin did. Butler was a much more aggressive atheist than Darwin, and this is his view of how we conceive of man, published not long after The Descent of Man. Man is but a perambulating toolbox and workshop, or office, fashioned for itself by a piece of very clever slime, as the long result of experience. And truth is but its own most enlarged, general, and enduring sense of the coming togetherness or convenience of the various conventional arrangements, which, for some reason or other, it has been led to sanction. Hence we speak of man's body as his trunk. The body is but a pair of pincers set over a bellows and a stew pan, and the whole fixed upon stilts. The most incorporate tool, as an eye or a tooth or the fist, when a blow is struck with it, has still something of the non-ego about it, and in like manner, such as a tool as a locomotive engine, apparently entirely separated from the body, must still from time to time, as it were, kiss the soil of the human body and be handled, and thus become incorporate with man, if it is to remain in working order. A man should see himself as a kind of toolbox. So if you ever throw a ball at somebody who's not expecting it, instinctively they will catch it or move out of the way. And that has a touch of the non-ego about it in Butler's terms. And there are all kinds of other examples of behaviours we could cite to illustrate how stuff we do is not a free intellectual choice, but something that happens automatically. And it's that idea of the automatic which is what encourages Butler in this very flamboyant extended metaphor about the human as machine. Darwin, at the end of The Descent of Man, tries to liberate humanity from the idea of the instinct by writing about many ways in which language in particular helps humanity to transcend the instinctive impulses of the body. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read all of this passage out, but just to illustrate some of the key aspects here that we might draw upon later in the module. The idea of the social animal, for example, and the idea of sympathy, ways in which social instincts are not instincts in the way that bodily instincts are, and which allow us to guarantee or cling on to some sense of morality as that which distinguishes the human from the animal. So if instinct is that which expresses continuity, social instinct is a way in which Darwin sees us as having risen above the animality that's stamped into our body. So that is one of the higher instincts, the idea of the social instinct, the idea of sympathy. And another that was a very controversial element of The Descent of Man was his supposition that beauty is not unique to humanity. So if social instincts elevate humanity, his writing about beauty kind of deflates humanity again. And this was particularly annoying to John Ruskin, the Sheffield-based art critic, who thought that Darwin's views about beauty and art were heretical. Because Darwin's point, chapter 3 of The Descent of Man, which I think is fairly obvious, is that sexual selection, sexual display amongst animals indicates very clearly that there must be something that approximates to a sense of beauty or aesthetics amongst animals. So here's a colourful image of the luxurious plumage of a male bird of paradise trying to seduce the rather drab female. This is what Darwin says about beauty here. This sense has been declared to be peculiar to man. I refer here only to the pleasure given by certain colours, forms and sounds which may fairly be called a sense of the beautiful. With cultivated men, such sensations are, however, intimately associated with complex ideas and trains of thought. So preeminent humanity emerges there. But when we behold a male bird elaborately displaying his graceful plumes or splendid colours before the female, whilst other birds not less decorated make no such display, it is impossible to doubt that she admires the beauty of her male partner. As women everywhere deck themselves with these plumes, the beauty of such ornaments cannot be disputed. As we shall see later, the nests of hummingbirds and the playing passages of bowerbirds are tastefully ornamented with gaily coloured objects, and this shows that they must receive some kind of pleasure from the sight of such things. So, what is thought to be spiritual, artistic, cultivated beauty exists, albeit in rudimentary terms, in the animal kingdom, whatever that is. Moving on. So, a final point about the balancing act between continuity and separationism in how Darwin views humans and animals over time. So this passage from The Expression of Oceans in Man and Animals, published the year after The Descent of Man, is a moment in which Darwin looks at certain evidences of the distinctiveness of humanity and tries to locate them in evolutionary time, speculatively. So, for example, laughter, which we think of as being unique to human, as a sign of pleasure and enjoyment, was practiced by progenitors long before they deserved to be called human. So rather than being a sign of the human, it's actually part of the proto-human. Or fear was expressed from an extremely remote period in almost the same manner as it is now by man. So going back into the deeper past of evolutionary time. Suffering, if great, will from the first have caused screams or groans to be uttered, the body to be contorted, and the teeth to be ground together. But our progenitors will not have exhibited those highly expressive movements of the features which accompany screaming and crying, until their circulatory and respiratory organs, and the muscles surrounding these eyes, had acquired their present structure. The shedding of tears appears to have originated through reflex action from the spasmodic contraction of the eyelids, together perhaps with the eyeballs becoming gorged with blood during the act of screaming. Therefore, weeping probably came on rather late in the line of our descent. Our nearest allies, the anthropomorphous apes, do not weep. He goes on to conclude, however, that the expression of grief and anxiety is eminently human. I think the key note about this passage is that what we might think of as the elevated signs of humanity as a distinctive exceptional species are enabled by bodily function. So it's the circularity in respiratory organs and the muscles surrounding the eyes that enable weeping. So we think of weeping as a sign of particular spiritual or sensitivity, a particular sympathetic relationship to the world, but it can't happen without muscles, which of course are stamped with a lowly origin. So again, there's an ambivalent indeterminacy between the human and the animal in the way in which what is lofty is always facilitated by what is corporeal, what is bodily. So just two last slides from me about how we might think of this polarity between human and animal as being connected to others. So often polarities are related. One is hierarchically elevated, one is hierarchically debased. So human good, animal bad, man good, woman bad, civilized good, savage bad. These kind of reductive hierarchies that have beset history. If you've read Descent of Man closely, you'll have noticed there are recurrent discourses of race here. And in the conclusion, he illustrates his case by reference to savages. I'm speaking, of course, under erasure when I pronounce that word in the far tip of South America. This goes back to Darwin's first great work, The Voyage of the Beagle, from the 1830s, which recounts his trip around the world in a boat to the Galapagos Islands, where he kind of did the research that led to the origin of species. And this is a work of colonial natural history. So it demonstrates Britain's preeminence in the world at that period. And this is clearly a moment in which a rather stark racism appears in Darwin's writing. The main conclusion arrived at in this work, namely that man is descended from some lowly organised form, will, I regret to think, be highly distasteful to many. But there can hardly be a doubt that we are descended from barbarians. The astonishment which I felt on first seeing a party of Fuegians on a wild and broken shore will never be forgotten by me, for the reflection at once rushed into my mind. Such were our ancestors. These men were absolutely naked and bedaubed with paint. Their long hair was tangled, their mouths frothed with excitement, and their expression was wild, startled, and distrustful. They possessed hardly any arts, and like wild animals lived on what they could catch. They had no government, and were merciless to everyone not of their own small tribe. So it's a convention of the kind of colonial natural history writing that Darwin is looking back to here, that the journey through space is a journey back in time. So going back to proto-man, a savage state, which involves all kinds of presumptions about other civilizations that we would now clearly not wish to make. But this does not mean that we can hold on to Darwin as a thoroughgoing racist. He was, as the other quotation on this slide demonstrates, a vigorous opponent of slavery throughout his life. And I won't read all of this quotation, but it ends by saying, it makes one's blood boil to think that we Englishmen and our American descendants, with their boastful cry of liberty, have been and are so guilty of slavery, that is. But it is a consolation to reflect that we at least have made a greater sacrifice than ever made by any nation to expiate our sin. So he's dealing there with British abolitionist movements, of which he was a great supporter, trying to expiate the sin of slavery. So these two passages are an interesting counterpoint. We might talk about that in the workshop possibly. And discourses of gender in Darwin, again, a very large topic that I'll just gesture quite briefly towards here. So there really ought to be things in Darwin that provoke feminist ire. So the first sentence in this passage from the Descent of Man, which isn't in the course pack actually, man is more powerful in body and mind than woman, and in a savage state he keeps her in a far more abject state of bondage than does the male of any other animal. He's concerned here with sexual selection, which is slightly different from natural selection. So natural selection is where evolutionary change happens because of death. Beings are poorly adapted to the environment, they die before they breed, their genetic line dies out. But sexual selection is to do with pleasure and desire. So evolutionary information is communicated because a female bird likes the male bird with the big feathers. So therefore, bird with big feathers more likely to pass genetic information down the evolutionary chain. So there are more birds with more luxurious feathers. So the power of selection is an intensely gendered issue for Darwin. So who is in control of evolutionary change and sexual selection? So the idea he posits is that in humanity, men have control over sexual selection, that women have long been selected for beauty, he argues here. We might want to mess with that notion, as did many women from the 1870s onwards. So two references here I'd recommend you to look at these texts. Two of the key works of feminist evolutionary theory, The Sexes Throughout Nature by Antoinette Brown Blackwell, and The Evolution of Woman by Eliza Gamble, both American scholars. And if you're interested in more recent feminist approaches to Darwin, and Elizabeth Gross has done I think the best work on that, Becoming Undone. And she writes about the ambivalent and multi-stranded and complicated relationships between feminism and Darwinism, and she's particularly interesting on sexual selection. So sexual selection is something that transcends ideas of mere kind of use. So she writes that sexual selection is a principle of excess in relation to survival. This energetic excess is the condition for the production of biological and cultural extravagance, the uncontainable production of intensification, not for the sake of the skills of survival, but simply because of its force of bodily intensification, its capacity to arouse pleasure or desire, its capacity to generate sensation. Darwin understood far better than his contemporaries the irreducibility of sexual selection to strategies of survival, whether linked to gene maximization or the creation of ever greater numbers of progeny. So desire in Darwin's thought, Gross points out, is never straightforwardly reducible to a utilitarian business of passing your genetic information on, but is much more intense, much more excessive, and much weirder than that. And there's another text you might want to look at, Bruce Bagamor's classic study, Biological Exuberance, Animal Homosexuality and Natural Diversity, that puts to sword notions that heterosexuality is somehow natural, that the animal kingdom is inclined towards heterosexuality. There's all kinds of what might conservatively be called deviant sexual behaviours that are evidenced in the animal world, which helps us to understand sexuality as being in excess of ideas of survival and kind of normative human heterosexist ideas of sexual behaviour.
So I'm particularly interested in how Darwin deconstructs this term of the so-called human. And while John is talking about beauty, I'm going to talk about diseases and the details of correspondences between this so-called human and the animal. So first of all, I would look at some passages from the Descent of Man, where Darwin talks about various forms of diseases, hereditary or non-contagious or contagious, as well as infestations. So there appears to me a strong analogy between the same infection or contagion producing the same result or one closely similar in two distinct animals. Monkeys are liable to many of the same non-contagious diseases as we are, and he mentions a few in the Descent of Man, where he also talks about how man is infested with both internal and external parasites, all of which belong to the same genera or families as those infesting other animals, and in the case of scabies, to the same species. So I'm interested particularly about how disease and infection, contagion, infestation, and parasites sort of demolish what is considered to be that which is proper to the human. In fact, to the point of revealing that there is no such thing that is proper to the human that doesn't also belong to other forms of life. This also raises questions about what is inside and what is outside, and I'm fascinated by that distinction, or how it fails to be upheld when subjected to close analysis. And I'm referring initially to a work, relatively recent work by Roberto Esposito, Immunitas, who also works a lot on biopolitics, referring back to last week's workshop and reading as well, referring back to Foucault's work on population control, as well as on the control of the individual body. Whether the danger that lies in wait is a disease threatening the individual body, a violent intrusion into the body politic, or a deviant message entering the body electronic, what remains constant is the place where the threat is located, always on the border between the inside and the outside, between the self and the other, the individual and the common. Someone or something penetrates a body, individual or collective, and alters it, transforms it, corrupts it. The term that best lends itself to representing this dynamic of dissolution, thanks precisely to the semantic polyvalence that places it at the crossroads of biology, law, politics, and communication, is contagion. So this border between the inside, the outside, the self and other, individual and the collective, is something, a sort of limit, trophy, this is a word from Derrida, a sort of threshold that is put under pressure. How do you uphold these distinctions when, for example, to refer back to Darwin's writing, diseases enter the body either from outside or lie in waiting within, and are contagious, and you've got various. There's a French theorist called Michel Serres who works on the parasite, which is interesting but quite puzzling work as well if you're interested in looking that up. But these distinctions between inside and outside is something that Jacques Derrida, who you'll come across regularly over the next 3 years, he puts a lot of pressure on that kind of binary as well, the inside and the outside. Perhaps the inside is that which is valued more than that which is outside, the inside of the body, which must be kept safe and from the other. So I'm going to refer briefly to Derrida's The Law of Genre, a really fantastic article that those of you who are going to do critical context next term are going to look at in more detail. He's not only talking about genre in relation to literary studies, but genre in French also refers to gender. And in that brilliant article, Derrida talks about how at the very heart of the law of genre itself there exists a principle of contamination, an internal division of the trait, impurity, corruption, contamination, decomposition, perversion, deformation, even cancerization, lots of spelling mistakes, and generous proliferation. So he's kind of talking about how you cannot ever exclude from a genre other works that might fit into that particular genre, because each text does something slightly different from the preceding text. So at the very heart of this law of genre, there always exists something that slightly deviates, which is this internal impurity or generous proliferation. Derrida also refers to it as invagination, sort of folding within the heart of the law, which always includes that which is somehow outside, but at the same time always already within. And we can draw parallels to Judith Butler's work here too, who she in Gender Trouble is obviously concerned with the fact that there is no such thing as an innate gender, but gender is always something that is incessantly performed. And she also draws heavily on the work of Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger, which I highly recommend, and where both scholars are also concerned with that boundary, or a very permeable boundary between the inside and the outside. Butler here actually is very specifically talking about the anus, but I'm going to read the slide here. I've excluded the anal part, but it's well worth looking at in Gender Trouble. So what constitutes Through the vision, the inner and outer worlds of the subject is a border and boundary tenuously maintained for the purposes of social regulation and control. So she's very much concerned with border policing, and this obviously also refers to politics and biopolitics at large, about those who are let inside the country and those who must remain out with. So for inner and outer worlds to remain distinct, the entire surface of the body would have to achieve an impossible impermeability. So the Home Office security and an impossible impermeability, and the sealing of its surfaces would constitute the seamless boundary of the subject. So you have very, very clear continuances here between the body and the body of the nation as well. Right. So, I would like to end with drawing your attention to the way that Darwin insists on the subject's multiplicity and on the so-called human's contamination, if you wish, with other, so apparently outside elements that we, however, bear always already within. In the embryos of all breathing vertebrates, certain glands, called the corpora wolffiana, correspond with and act like the kidneys of mature fishes. A single fish is two fish. Even at a later embryonic period, some striking resemblances between man and the lower animals may be observed. And obviously in The Descent of Man, Darwin catalogues a whole range of striking resemblances between so-called man and the lower animals, beginning with diseases, but going through all sorts of elements, also language, as well as teeth, which I'm particularly interested in as well, and the hand also, actually. That also reminds me, I wanted to mention something about the hand. I'm quite interested in hands, and to refer back to John's quotation from Samuel Butler, man as toolbox. It is also not only that man is always about becoming animal, but to begin with, the human must be understood as absolutely technologized, because the hand is always already conceptualized as a tool, as is language. These are always already techniques that are that make us up. So there is no such thing as the human, actually, because there's always already otherness within us. I'm going to refer to two French theorists called Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who collaborate a lot on works in the 70s largely. We return to them when we look at Freud as well, because they work a lot with psychoanalysis or against psychoanalysis, or the conventional idea of psychoanalysis at any rate. And in their tome, A Thousand Plateaus, they discuss what they call becoming animal. We believe in the existence of very special becomings, animal traversing human beings and sweeping them away. And this actually refers, I think, or echoes something that Darwin writes in The Descent of Man, which is when he's talking about how aspects and elements might pass into each other. So it's this idea of being traversed by the other and sweeping away this idea of the human as something that is impermeable and totally separate from the rest of the living beings around us. So we do not become animal without a fascination for the pack, for multiplicity, a fascination for the outside, or is the multiplicity that fascinates us already related to a multiplicity that is always already dwelling within us? Which brings us to the workshop tasks. So we would like you to think about these multiplicities that are dwelling within us, and to think and put pressure on this border between the inside and the outside, between self and other, the individual and the common, and also perhaps to link that to political practices, and to isolate a paragraph from this week's reading that demonstrates this dynamic. And the larger questions for this week's workshop is to think through these three oppositions: human and animal, civilized, savage, man and woman, and to also reflect on whether one is more stable than the others. That's us for today.
Good night.
Good night and good luck.